My name is Nikki from NorthPoint. With me tonight is Dr. Ryan Yamka of Guardian Pet Food. He is with us to discuss two things. As most of you know, this was supposed to be a live event here at NorthPoint. And one of the topics that we got in multiple times was how to take care of our senior pets. How do we manage protein amounts, calories, obesity as our dogs, or even cats for that matter, age. And so Dr. Yamka was nice enough to address those issues. So we're going to go over that really quick. And then the main event tonight, which I know everybody is joining for as we get the viewers up here, is grain-free dog food and heart disease. Over the last couple of years, there's been a few FDA reports out discussing the potential association between grain-free dog food and something called dilated cardiomyopathy, or DCM. It's something that I've done a lot of work on, research on. I have a white paper on our website. Dr. Yamka has spoke on the topic multiple times, has done a lot of research, has combed through the data like nobody else has. And I've asked him to come here and showcase what some of the truths are, what the facts are, and just have an open discussion. I'm really excited that he's here to do that. Please, in the comments, two things I want you guys to do. Drop your questions as they come. We do have our team monitoring that, and they will compile all of that so that I can ask Ryan at the end. The other thing I want you guys to do, and this has kind of been a theme since we've started our doing these live since this coronavirus issue, drop pictures of your pets and then also what you guys are drinking. Since this is Canines and Cocktails, even though we're doing it on a virtual format. Tonight I have a vodka and soda with clementines. And what do you got?
My go-to is a Hendrix and tonic with cucumbers. As lame as it sounds, it tastes good.
So I'm going to actually let Ryan go over his credentials and what makes him the expert about talking about this topic tonight. I'm going to go ahead and do a screen share. And like I said, drop your questions in the comments and we'll get moving.
All right, good to go?
Good to go.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for coming online today. Unfortunately, obviously, we're all locked down in quarantine. In case those that are concerned, have plenty of sanitizer here, and neither one of us have been running the temperature, so that's good. So we're going to talk about a couple topics today. One is the nutrition considerations for the aging canine, and then the other one, as Nikki alluded to, is DCM, and really that's the talk that I gave at the Veterinary Meeting Expo. Many of you that were following me online had seen bits and pieces of it, but we'll actually bring it all together today and walk you through what the data shows and doesn't show. But first, we'll start off with nutrition considerations for the aging canine. And before we get started, just give you an idea of my background. I did work for Hill's Pet Nutrition for a few years, and I also worked for Hart's Mountain. I was Senior Vice President R&D at Blue Buffalo. For about 4 years after they went public, I started my own consulting company, and then finally launched my startup with Jim Golofsky, Guardian Pet Food Company. We make freeze-dried, complete and balanced meal bars for dogs, and it's 100% natural. My credentials, so I have very expensive wallpaper. Could have been a lake house in Maine. Whenever the universities call and ask for a donation, I said, sorry, I've already done that. But I received 2 bachelor degrees, Virginia Tech, a master's, a Ph.D. at Kentucky, which was actually in canine nutrition. I actually did research for Hills during my master's and Ph.D. While I was at Hills, I earned my MBA, and I also became a certified professional animal scientist. I'm a diplomat with the American College of Animal Sciences in canine feline nutrition. 2011, I won the Corbin Companion Animal Biology Award, which is the highest award you can win in American Society of Animal Sciences. I became a fellow American College of Nutrition, which is human nutrition. And lastly, I won the Pet Age Icon Award in 2019. Without going into the nitty gritty, have a bunch of manuscripts that have been peer reviewed and abstracts. And I also co-authored 2 book chapters in SACN 5, And those of you in the veterinary world, that's that big blue paperweight that probably sits on your desk. Hopefully you use it. I wrote in the macronutrient section as well as the obesity section. Then I also write articles debunking myths and misconceptions for Pet Food Industry magazine. So let's focus on nutrition considerations for the aging canine. Well, first, let's talk what is a mature adult dog. Frankly, I went back to FACN 5 to look up, okay, well, what really defines a mature dog? And it can be defined by different things. And so depending on who you are, what you are, what type of breed dog you have, obviously smaller breeds will tend to have a later mature adult age than large breeds will. And obviously that's based off of mortality rates. But lots of times what people talk about is when something first happens from an aging standpoint in the animal. But the reality of it is it's typically considered 6 to 8 years of age or older. And this really includes the third quarter of the average lifespan. So for a lot of people who think it's, you know, a defined number of 7 or whatever it is, it's really going to be breed specific. And typically, obviously, body size plays a factor. One thing to recognize is aging is not a disease. So for those of us that have been around a while, we're not diseased, we're simply aging, but it does increase the vulnerability of some diseases. And so obviously a great example is in the news lately with coronavirus, right? People over a certain age are more vulnerable to the secondary issues and potentially death tied to the disease, while the younger folks are not. Also, we know that nutrition can play a role in the vulnerability of some of these diseases, but it's actually very difficult to evaluate, and it hasn't really been explored in dogs. Well, most people's, the answer is no, it hasn't. Most of the aging studies that have been done have actually been done in clinical settings with certain breeds of dogs, in particular beagles. But, you know, how do you control for environment, genetics, what the mother, a dog or cat is eating just during gestation, and more importantly during the nurturing and other things that go on. And so I know obviously you might have genetics that are predisposed for something. Some people, you know, could live to be 100 that are smokers, and others die at 40. So there's lots of factors that play into that. But the overall goal when you're feeding a mature dog and cat, for that matter, is you want to optimize quality of life as well as longevity of life and minimize disease. It isn't always about the length of life, especially if they're in pain, right? So you want to focus on quality. And since aging is progressive, the time at which a food change should be made is generally an arbitrary or philosophical discussion. And so what I mean by that, a lot of pet parents out there don't think they have a senior dog until arthritis shows up in them or something like that. And they may not recognize the early signs of graying in the face and less activity and things of that nature, or from a physical standpoint, but on the inside, internally, there could be a lot of things going on. Similar to humans, canine aging is associated with, you know, myriad of diseases, and, you know, obviously arthritis, weakened muscles and bones, reduced lean mass, right? Remember how before you went to college and got the freshman 15, you had awesome metabolism. Obviously, you can't party like that anymore, you know, otherwise you get a nice beer belly. Cancer obviously increases risk. You also have derm issues, cognitive ability. There's been plenty of studies done by Bill Milgram and others looking at DHA and its role in senior animals, which is very similar to puppies and kittens. You also have reduced energy for many reasons. You have decreased immune function, decreased renal function, and obviously urinary incontinence goes hand in hand with all of that. But thing that's pretty neat and cool, where there is data that looks at aging versus young, and it's actually multiple studies. They're not all listed here, but the FACN publication that I cite at the bottom is a perfect review, and you could see all the different versions and studies that are done. But in general, there is no difference in digestibility for dry matter, protein, fat, or energy. Which comes probably to a surprise to most people, but there is really no difference. But with that being said, mature dogs do have a lower metabolic energy requirement. And it's been estimated to be less than 20% compared to adult dogs. So what does that mean? Well, in a mature dog, you should have less fat than you would in an adult dog. And so if you look at typical diets in the marketplace, most regular adult dogs, 1 to 7, are typically like 16% fat. And then if you look at senior 7+, we typically drop to 13%. And so mature dogs should be consuming less calories. And those of you familiar with where do you get the biggest bang for your buck, it's going to be fat. So it's not changing carbohydrate and protein, because from a metabolizable energy standpoint, they're equal. And one of the things that we talked about in a previous slide is that fat to lean body mass, right? So too much fat, not enough protein. Well, what's going to happen is you increase your likelihood for obesity, and you have decreased muscle mass. And we'll talk about, what you should be doing or looking for in mature adult dog foods. Also, there's studies that show that mature dogs tend to have a lower glucose response, which results in a decreased insulin response. And so the studies that have actually done that indicates that you should have a lower carbohydrate content in mature adult dogs, or utilize low glycemic carbohydrate sources. One of the difficulties with that is when you look at dry foods, when you go through an extruder, for argument's sake, all starches kind of become equal because you gelatinize it to make them highly available. But when you look in whole foods and fresh foods, it would behave differently. And then the adequate intake of dietary protein for dogs at maintenance vary widely. And why is that? Nobody has really done the research to say what is true for an adult dog versus a mature adult dog. And given the information that we do know about mature adult dogs, one would think that the protein requirements should be higher than adult dogs, right? Because you want to lower that fat content and you want to prevent that lean muscle loss in that stage of life. So let's talk about mature dogs and protein, and we'll focus strictly on protein for this talk. Obviously, there's lots of other nutrients beneficial for mature dogs, but today it'll just be protein. So if you look at, again, the FACN 5 for middle age and older is the chapter and pages that are at the bottom. The recommendations of protein intake for mature dogs is debatable. And so depending on what company's talking to you today, they'll tell you, hey, you need to be low protein in a senior dog, or another company may tell you it needs to be higher. And this is a very similar debate that what goes on in human nutrition as well. So if you actually look up human studies, you'll see people that believe it should be lower protein, others saying it's higher. But the reality of it is it'll come to quality approach as well. As we discussed previously, mature dogs have a decrease in muscle mass. So, their fat to lean ratio actually goes up because they're getting fatter and they're wasting away their muscle. And there's a reason for that because, there is changes in the body and protein synthesis and turnover. And with that knowledge, for the companies that tell you that, hey, increased protein should be the way to go after senior dogs, that's what they're seeing and that's why they recommend it. But there's other ones that have been around for a while that obviously own prescription diet. KD is a great example. They believe that reduced protein intake is important because there's an increased prevalence of renal disease in older dogs. And those of you familiar with Hills, literally their first food out in the market was KD. And you can go on their website to learn that history. But the important thing to point out is that is only when there's renal disease involved. Should you be looking at reducing protein and more importantly, phosphorus. But to date, all the studies that have actually been conducted looking at high protein in healthy dogs, they do not show an increase in prevalence of renal disease or a cause and effect relationship. So what do I mean by that? High protein diets will not cause renal disease in healthy animals. However, if they do have renal disease, then that's when you should be looking at lower protein as well as lower phosphorus, and some would even argue lower sodium foods, because you have other diseases going on as well. So what do we know? Well, dietary protein is required to provide essential amino acids and replenish protein reserves. And think about it. If you don't have the protein reserves, you don't have the essential amino acids per se, your body's going to start ripping apart proteins and things of that nature, right? And so when protein intake is deficient in a lot of the senior foods you'll see in the marketplace, you end up having a decrease in protein turnover and a decrease in lean body mass. And so for those of you who end up moving to a certain food, those are some things you need to keep an eye on, because it can actually occur pretty rapidly. And then that's when you end up seeing, you know, your animal being more obese than lean. And so that's one of the things to consider when you're looking at your senior animal. And obviously you need to be your advocate for your animal. So notice those signs, notice them early, and, you know, ask questions. Again, numerous studies have confirmed that protein does not adversely affect the kidneys. In a healthy animal, there's no reason to go to a low protein, low phosphorus diet. Although, again, with chronic kidney failure that is existing, and again, I use KD, obviously worked for Hills, so I know the product well. That's when you would look for a low protein, low phosphorus diet. Again, there is no cause and effect. So feeding a high protein or higher protein food is not going to put you at risk. It will result in you losing lean body mass if you go to a lower protein food. And so in short, you know, if you have a healthy older dog, you could be actually causing harm to the animal, because proteins are needed for other things and amino acids. And if you're in that I'll call it deficiency state, you could end up having a weakened immune system and other things that are going on. And, you know, some estimates say that protein should actually be increased by about 50% in older dogs, while the energy requirements go down. So what does that mean? Is you should be looking at a food, again, as the example I talked earlier. If your adult food is 16% fat, maybe your senior food should have 13. If you're at 20% protein, maybe you should be at 25% protein. And so when one goes down, one should go up. And I'll give you some examples here in a bit. So if you read Dottie LaFlamme's paper about dietary protein, and obviously you'll see this on all my slides, the references are at the bottom. So I'm not making the data up, and you guys can look it up yourselves, and as well as you should be given access to this, and obviously this will be repeated on Facebook if you missed something I said and you want more notes on it. But if you read her paper and you actually look at everything we went through, both from SACN 5, both from the FACN paper and what she looks at and reviews, the conclusion is older dogs or mature dogs should receive at least 25% of their calories from protein. Well, most of you are probably sitting there going, well, what the heck does that mean? Well, we could talk about that in a little bit. So before we get there, what we're going to do is we're going to go through Pet Food 101. And so for you all that aren't familiar with how to calculate that 25%, I'm going to show you tricks of the trade, where you can calculate where the calories are coming from. And so what's the benefit of that? Well, you can use it across any food. And you can find out how much protein calories are being used for metabolizable energy, how much is coming from fat, and more importantly, those of you that are not big fans of carbohydrates, you can calculate the carbohydrate content as well. So let's start out with, okay, where do these numbers come from? Well, in the industry, we refer to it as approximate analysis. Approximate analysis is typically what you're going to see as your guaranteed analysis statement. When you send a food sample into the lab, they simply put it into an oven to get to dry matter. And from there, you know your moisture content. For argument's sake, typical dog food's dry food is about 8% moisture, and cats will be right around 6%. Once you have that dry material, you simply take it, you throw it in the oven, and think about the first time you ever ruined a dinner in the oven and you literally charred it to nothing but ash. That's where ash comes from. Ash is critical in calculation I'll talk about later, but typical dry foods range from 6 to 8%. For whatever reason, I'm not sure why, many pet food companies will not put that on their bag. So if you're trying to do some of these calculations at home, it's fair to say you can assume 7% ash, because typically it's 6 to 8% ash in a kibbled formula. And so from that, you get organic matter, and that's where your carbon compounds are coming from. So your protein, your fat, your fiber, and nitrogen-free extract. And so there's different analyses that can get you there for protein, fat, and fiber. So what am I missing? Well, obviously it's the carbohydrate portion, which you see in the green box. And that is simply calculated by taking 100 minus the other guys. And I'll walk you through a calculation here. So carbohydrate or nitrogen-free extract is another way of talking about not only traditional carbohydrates, but also sugars in the food. And carbohydrate, or NFE, is simply 100% minus percent moisture, minus percent crude protein, minus percent crude fat, minus percent crude fiber, and minus percent ash. So this is what you typically see on the bag. Some will give you omega-6s, omega-3s, or whatever, but it's irrelevant for what we're doing right now. But the info that you see on the bag is you'll see a guaranteed analysis of moisture, max 10%. In this case, protein's 20, crude fat's 11.5, crude fiber is 4. For those of you who want to know what they typically analyze at, assuming they do analyze, I usually say for these guys, assume that it's off by 2 percentage units. So that food is going to be analyzed on probably around 8% moisture. Protein will probably be about 22%. Fat would be about 13, 13.5, and crude fiber would be 2, because that's a maximum, right? So with that info on the bag, and the trick I told you that most kibble dry foods have ash ranges to 6 to 8%, let's assume it's 7% for our argument. So if I take carbohydrate and I take 100 and I subtract 10, I subtract 20, I subtract 11.5, I subtract 4, and finally 7, I get a carbohydrate content of 47.5%. Unfortunately, that number is not all that uncommon in kibbles because they need all that starch to hold that kibble together. Typically, you'll see most foods at best, they can get down to about 20, 25% carbohydrate, but typically you're going to see 30% or higher depending on who's making the food and the process. So, metabolizable energy. Metabolizable energy is obviously the energy your body needs to, in essence, go above basal and your daily activities and everything else. The top line is what you're seeing is the Atwater equation. And they use cofactors of 3.5 times crude protein, 8.5 times crude fat, and 3.5 times carbohydrate. For those of you who want to geek out on that, you can read more about it online as far as why do they have different cofactors. But the reality of it is it comes down to the ability to be efficient in creating energy and storing energy in the body. Obviously, fat, is pretty easy to store. Even though crude protein and carbohydrate are both 3.5, crude protein is actually a little lower. And then also Atwater takes into certain assumptions, or for argument's sake, when you look at foods as far as accuracy of predicting and running true MEs, it's about 80% digestible is where the numbers fall in, which is typical for kibble. So we take our factors from the front and we drop in the 20, the 11.5, and 47.5. What we do is we figure out, okay, our metabolizable energy for the food is 3,340 kcals per kilogram. Well, you're like, okay, that's cool, but what do I do with that? Well, if I take the 70 and divide by 334, I find out really quick that I'm at 21% calories coming from protein. Fat will be 29.3, and you see carbs is 50% of the energy coming from that food from an ME standpoint. And so this becomes important for you all if you ever want to do the quick math to figure out, where the calories are coming from. Now, if you don't want to go through all the trouble of doing that first stage, you could simply do the calculations of what I have here for protein and then fat, and then from 334, you subtract out the protein and fat numbers to get to carbs, and that's another cheat that you can get at to figure that out, because all of your energy will come from those 3 macronutrients. So back to original statement, older dogs should receive at least 25% of their calories from protein. So let's look at a couple examples. So typical adult dry kibble, if I look at it on a dry matter or moisture basis, it doesn't matter because the percentages are still the percentages. But if crude protein's 22.7, crude fat's 15, and carbohydrates 52.7, what I figure out very quickly is, even in this case, regular adult dry kibble food would not meet the energy or protein demands for a senior animal based on the knowledge that is out there. And as you would imagine, based on how certain companies do it, if you go to a 7+ formula, or even in some cases 11+ or 13+, depending on the company, they typically drop down the protein, and you see you're actually in worst case scenario. And so in this case, we're seeing 16.9% of the calories come from crude protein. And so in this situation, this would be indicative of an animal that is losing lean body mass and putting on fat. And so this is not a good situation if you know the research and you follow the research out there. So again, in a healthy, mature adult animal, you're actually depriving them of protein and, more importantly, essential amino acids to do their daily functions, if you will, including the immune system. So what should a 7+ dog food look like? Well, if I assume fat level does not change, really I should go almost as high as 28%. And when I do that, that's when I finally achieve that 25% calories coming from protein. And so obviously I assume fat stayed at 13.7 because we discussed it should be lower in fat. But as you can see, it's a big swing, where most foods out there are probably around 19%. They're probably almost off by literally 10 percentage units. So, quick, tricks for you guys when you're out there looking at bags of food and things of that nature. And again, teaching you all how to be your own advocate for your senior animals, especially if they're healthy and you want them to stay lean and not succumb to obesity and obesity related diseases. These are the types of things you need to keep an eye on. So quick summary. Again, older dogs should receive at least 25% of their calories from protein, right? We saw how high we had to go in the dry kibble example. There's lots of foods out there that actually will hit that number on the adult side. There's a lot of senior formulas that will not. Typically, your raw foods, your freeze-dried foods will have no problem hitting that because they're typically low carbohydrate. But if you're looking at foods that are kibble, obviously you're going to have to be pretty high up there, bumping 30% for argument's sake. Again, there is no data to support a cause and effect that protein causes increased risk for renal disease. That is information that is literally in FACN 5, which is that big blue book, as well as other studies out there. And those you don't know, this is the big blue book. Literally, it's almost there next to my head, so it's pretty big, and I got a big head. So from that standpoint, obviously it's in that book, it's in other literature. IMS, back when they were doing research, they saw the same thing, and obviously Purina did, and as did RC. So keep that in mind. Now, obviously, once they have renal disease, that's a different argument, different discussion, but it does not cause renal disease. Now that I showed you the tools, how to calculate what your dog is consuming, you should be able to look at foods and determine, are you meeting your needs, instead of waiting to that point where they're obese and have lost their lean body mass. And the math that I showed you, even though I used dry kibble, obviously that's the world I came from and know very well. So I used that as quick math. Obviously, kibble is top seller. but that math does not differ for any food format. So if you're doing a canned food, a freeze-dry food, a raw food, that math, it's math. So it applies for across all food types. And then the other thing you also need to consider is protein quality. Just because they have high protein in there, quantity does not equal quality. And so you're going to want to know things like the amount of essential amino acids that are in that food. And so, as I've been telling a lot of people, when looking at foods, you should be asking about, well, what's the digestibility from third party? That's dry matter, fat, protein, energy. That's a $3,000 study, so there's no reason why any company shouldn't have it. And then they should be doing a complete AFCO profile, analyzing regularly. And again, that's about another $3,000. So they should have that information. And so a quick way to look at the type of quality of protein you have is to get all the essential amino acids that they supply to you from a third-party lab, total them up, and then subtract it from crude protein, and that'll give you, argument's sake, what the non-essential is. And ideally, you're going to want to see your essential amino acids be greater than non-essential amino acids. Another indicator that the protein quality of the food may not be all there is when people start adding 4 or 5 or 6 synthetic amino acids. Typically, you'll see lysine, methionine, cysteine, threonine, tryptophan are the big ones that you'll see. And sometimes you'll even see taurine and carnitine thrown in there. So keep those things in mind when looking at the foods as well. So we'll pause there. Does anybody have any questions from?
Yeah, so we actually got a couple. The first one is from Brooke. Brooke asked Dr. Yamka, your credentials are incredible. Quick question. I understand you have done extensive work in domestic dogs. However, have you explored or compared the diet of domestic dogs to canids?
No, I have not. Not me personally. So all of my research has been literally in domestic dogs. A good group to talk to and follow would actually be the University of Illinois. And if you want to follow up, I can give you or give Nikki some context, because in addition to them putting out people into the pet food industry, they've actually put out people into the zoo world as well. And University of Illinois has actually looked at and compared different, I'll call it dog species, for lack of a better word, but, as well as cats. And they're looking at, similarities and differences, and even in fish or cats versus, depending on where you're at, mountain lions or cougars, as well as, different canids out there. But they have done some of that research, but it could certainly put you, if you're truly interested, in touch with a few people that actually live in the zoo world, and that's what they do. And they would be better off answering that question than I would.
Awesome.
So I can easily say I don't know on that, but I could get you in touch with people.
Next question is, what foods do you recommend for a senior?
Yeah. So as a rule of thumb, I do not, I simply educate. I don't advocate or humiliate. And so that's my rule of thumb. And so what I mean by that is I give you the tools to make that decision. And then obviously you take those tools to see, what food works best for you. And the reason I do that is because, obviously people that are raw advocates are raw advocates, but there also comes a point where if you're living in kibble world or the freeze-dried world, price point is going to hurt your piggy bank. And that doesn't mean you're a bad pet parent or owner, or, your fur baby is, worst off, or whatever lingo you use, which most of the ones I just said make veterinarians cringe. So I apologize for those of you listening out there. I said all of those. But when it comes to that, what you can simply do, and it's not uncommon, you'll even see it at Walmart, people flip over bags, and it's, you could probably ask Nikki, it's kind of a pet peeve for people when they trying to keep everything properly faced on the shelves, and people will actually flip over bags to compare it. So from that standpoint, obviously gave you the quick tricks of the trade, if you will. And from there you can start looking at, what type of foods that you feed. If you're, feeding brand X, chances are they probably have something in that portfolio that hits it. Most of the time, you'll see foods, and for argument's sake, their senior foods aren't all that different from their adult foods. So it might simply mean staying on the adult food.
Well, and for senior foods, like one of the things that we see a lot of times senior foods have is really the addition of glucosaminochondroitin or L-carnitine. A lot of times the nutrition, the macronutrient breakdown isn't much different. That being said, I think it's also a really hard question to answer because it's a very individualized question, right? What works for one dog is not going to work for the next. It's very breed specific, age specific, lifestyle specific. So really that's up to you, the pet parent. It's not as easy for either one of us to kind of give you an answer.
And unfortunately, when you start talking brands, it becomes an emotional argument sometimes, especially if you're a diehard for that brand. And what I mean is, you ride or die with them. And so, it can be a tough conversation to have to say, hey, you know what, you were feeding brand X, now you should feed brand Y. So it's really up to the individual, but at the very least, you should have the tools to ask the questions and at least educate yourself.